Stone Gap, Virginia. Hey,
Cool.
awesome. I'm glad you're joining us this morning. So we're going to get started. Welcome, if you haven't been here before, to our Friday's Escape to the Forest webinar series, last one for 2022. And, you know, we've had a great time doing these. We still have some slots for 2023. So if you've got topics that you'd like to hear, don't hesitate to let Marnie or I know. My name is Kathy Smith. I'm our Extension Program Director in Forestry for the School of Environment and Natural Resources in the College of Food, Agricultural, and Environmental Sciences.
Oh, you did the whole title.
Did the whole kit and caboodle. Marnie Tichnell is also here. She's my cohort in keeping woodland stewards running as of late, especially kind of propping me up as my time seems to be just a little wonkers. And like I said, I think today you guys are going to really enjoy this presentation. So I want everyone to know we do have ISA credits and we do have SAF credits. There will be a survey link posted in the chat box after we're done with the session, and you just fill in your name or in your ISA or SAF number, and we will get those into the national offices for you to get credits. Just kind of a quick what's going on in our universe at this point, what's on the calendar. Maple Days is next week, next Saturday at Ashland University, and we've got some great speakers, both from like Vermont and West Virginia and our Ohio crew. So it should be a good session. Next big meeting coming up first is March 1st, which is our 2023 Ohio Woodland, Water, and Wildlife Conference in Mansfield. It's geared towards natural resource professionals, and look for registration details after the first of the year. I try to get them up after January 1 and all the craziness of the holidays kind of starts to fade in our memories, hopefully. And then March 18th, it's Ohio's turn to host our Tri-State Ohio River Valley Woodland and Wildlife Workshop. We'll be at the Oasis Conference Center in Loveland, Ohio, and look for more on that to be posted as well. We're working on our speakers for both of those events, and hopefully everything comes together. I've got one slot that hasn't come together yet, and I keep trying to fill it with something, but we'll get there. So know that everything will be recorded today and will be posted under the resources tab in the webinars. As we work through today, we'll go through Enrico's presentation, and then we will tackle the Q&A, the questions you guys put. So please put your questions in the Q&A box. We'll try to monitor the chat box, but you have a better chance of getting your question read and answered if you're in the Q&A box. And you can kind of see here where it should pop up on your bar. So with that, unless I've missed something, Marnie, holler at me. Today we have with us Enrico Bonello, who's a professor in plant pathology, doing some really cool things. And I have to say, Enrico, when these plots that you did on campus popped up, everybody came to me and said, Kathy, who's planting those trees out there? What are those trees for? And I'm like, I don't know, not my trees.
We do things in secret. That's all.
Well, you certainly did, because the
Yeah.
ones that were really visible, I can't tell you how many questions I got. It was like, what are those? What are they doing? That's a really stupid place to plant seedlings. It's like,
Yeah.
I didn't have the knowledge. So hopefully today we can answer everybody's questions on that. So let me stop sharing, Enrico. So thanks for being with us today. And I'm looking forward to a great presentation.
Okay. Well, thanks for the introduction and all those nice thoughts.
Come on.
I will go ahead and share my my screen. You might see strange things. I'm actually going to share my screen, so you'll probably see a few things, because I want to make sure that I can switch between applications. Sometimes that doesn't happen very easily. So, all right. So I'm going to project my presentation now, and you should be able to see it in a second. Hopefully, crossing fingers. crossing fingers again. I don't know why it's not coming up. Hold on. There you go.
There you
Okay.
are.
All right. So topic for today is non-native invasive forest pests and sentinels. And I wonder if you were wondering what sentinels are in this context. And hopefully by the end of today, you'll have a good idea what I'm talking about. Also, I want to tell you that today I'm going to give it a very socio-economic slant to this talk. And hopefully that would also make sense by the end of the presentation. And then we can always explore concepts through Q&A at the end. All right. So with that, first things first, I want to shout out some acknowledgements because a lot of the presentation is based on a paper that we have developed. Actually, it says they're based on a paper in preparation for bioscience, and I forgot to change that because we switched, and it's actually now in consideration for annual review in phytopathology. That I'll come back to that, but as you can see, there were a number of institutions and folks involved in the development of these concepts that I'll be, expressing and presenting today. So key premises, I know that I am preaching to the choir here, but it is pretty clear that forest biodiversity is good, not just emotionally, but actually has a very strong scientific basis. If you look on the right here, let me see if I can change my pointer to the laser pointer. Okay. If you look on the right here, you can see biodiversity supports a whole suite of values that are critical for society. There's a lot of feedback loops in here, but fundamentally, it's super important to maximize high quality ecosystem services. For example, all of these that you see here, right? So I think I hope that we're all on the same page for this. It's important to preserve biodiversity, and anything that threatens forest biodiversity is almost by definition bad. All right. Also, to give you some stats that may be interesting, the values of healthy forests in the U.S. Healthy doesn't mean free from pests and pathogens, just means that they are self-supporting and over time, okay? They provide clean water supply for 200 million Americans, 12% sequestration, 12% carbon sequestration from the atmosphere, jobs, recreation, of course, and spiritual experiences, wildlife habitat, sales of forest products, and so on. So it's a lot of very important both ecosystem services, but also direct economic values to society. So once again, anything that affects the integrity and resilience of forest environments is by definition bad, especially if you talk to people like us, like me, Kathy, and Marn. So there are many threats to forest biodiversity. It's not just invasion by these lethal non-native invasive pathogens, but that's what we're talking today. I like to affectionately call them PIPs, pathogens and insect pests. So these invariably come into a new environment by way of international commerce. And again, they're one of the major threats to forest integrity and by extension, forest biodiversity and all the ecosystem services provided by forests. So in this talk, I'll focus on temperate forest ecosystems, particularly North American, but obviously the concepts can easily be expanded to the tropics or any other biome around the world. So let's talk a bit about these tree-killing pips. Very briefly, many examples, a lot of them are already known to you. For example, bark and wood borers, canker and wilt fungi. These are the killers because they affect tissue in the trees that is vital to the survival of the stem. So one thing is to be defoliated by a pathogen, after which you can always refoliate and somehow survive. Another one is to have your phloem in the trunk being destroyed by emerald ash borer, for example. or having cankers that completely girdle your main stem, like you have with pine blister rust, which results in direct death of the trees, right? So that's when this is what we're talking about, these tree-killing pips. Or another example is wilt fungi. These are the ones that grow inside the xylem vessels and essentially obstruct water conduction so that the tree dies of thirst, essentially. Things like oak wilt, for example. So how are they introduced? The ones that are non-native, and emerald ash borer is non-native. So is white pine blister rust, the pathogen that causes white pine blister rust, called Crenatium brabicola. Well, they come in through international commerce. And this can happen in many different ways, and many different pathways favor many different types of pips. So dunnage and pallets obviously are the ones that are responsible for the importation of wood boring insects for the most part, not so much pathogens. Ship structures, though, are also important. You have bugs like the formerly called gypsy moth, which is now, I think it's called spongy moth, that can stick to any surfaces, or even, spotted lanternfly. All of them invariably come in through containers. Container ships are the major culprits. Airlines and airplanes are sort of secondary because containers contain a lot of dunnage and pallets and other material. And then a biggie is also live plants for planting, what we call P4P, 4 number, because these are essential for the importation and movement of pathogens and insects that necessitate a live host to move around. So, for example, sudden oak death, which I'm sure you guys have heard about, or even we are speculating these days, although we're not 100% certain, beech leaf disease, the nematode that causes beech leaf disease, probably came in through live importation of live Japanese beech. There's no evidence at this point, don't quote me on this, but I think it's a good chance that that's how it came into Northeast Ohio, probably through the port of Cleveland. All right. So we sort of keep dithering, though. We keep in many ways doing the same things over and over, hoping for a different end result, sort of the definition of madness. And this is just an example, and this only goes up to 2008, of the number of invasive pathogens in Europe alone. This was a paper that came out back in 2012. And as you can see, over time, since the 1800s, it's really been an exponential growth. So these are pests that are actually getting established in Europe. And we have identical curves essentially for the United States, for example. And particularly for the United States in particular, the northeastern and eastern forests are particularly prone to this because we have a very diverse biome here with lots of different tree species that can serve as targets. And a ton of commerce occurs through the East Coast. So that's where gypsy moth came in, and many others, emerald ash borer and so on. So in theory, we know what to do. If we look at the invasion curve, and this is just one example, one incarnation of the invasion curve. I mean, if you go back here and you look at this portion of the invasion here, you can see it again right here. And theoretically, if you look at the extent of the ecological invasion on this axis, you go up, and at some point there has to be a plateau because something will limit the number of invasions, but we're nowhere close to that. And we're hoping that our management would help sort of make this curve plateau like this. But anyway, we recognize 4 different phases in the invasion curve. One is before the invasive species arrival, and in that case, we need a proactive threat assessment, understanding what's out there in the world that could be a threat to our forest environments. But once they come in, we have to be able to provide, perform early detection and hopefully eradicate the problem. Unfortunately, in 99.9% of the cases, we're not able to eradicate the problem. There's very, very few examples where we have succeeded. One of them is that, Asian longhorn beetle, we keep snuffing out infestation centers, and that snuffing out is successful locally. But if you follow the news, there's always new infestation, one, someplace or another, that we have to take care of. Then you have this sort of the exponential spread phase and so on. And once you're here, it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to do anything about it. Okay. Obviously, economic and ecological benefits are highest when you don't have an invader, and they are reduced, over time as the invasion progresses. What we need in terms of averting what we call the invasive species crisis is to work at the nexus of biology, technology, and social science. And very often we are stuck into only one of them. And very often we're only stuck in the biology. We think we can solve the problem just by looking at biotechnology, ecology, epidemiology, and that sort of thing. Whereas in practice, systems modeling, biosecurity are probably much more important. And I think, in my opinion, and this will be hopefully highlighted in this talk, the social science component is the one that really does us in constantly from invasion to management. So I would like to posit that human activities have fundamental social dimensions, particularly related to the international commerce I was referring to. The answer, in theory, should be think globally and act locally. So, in other words, be a good actor locally to benefit all of humanity. Being a good actor locally, for example, would translate into having good sanitary measures on the material that you export to a different country, right? We'll get to that. Unfortunately, special and national interests almost always conflict with this aspiration. And really, for society, because of all these issues, the forest health crisis is what we call a wicked problem. And a wicked problem has very specific characteristics. So if you say wicked, it sounds like very, very difficult, right? But in science, it has a special significance, especially when it comes to social problems. So, for example, disagreement about the definition of the problem, economic interests versus other issues like human rights, climate, and so on. There is no stopping rule because global trade ain't going to stop anytime soon, right? Solutions are only incremental. There's no progress yet, and none without the stakeholders. If people don't buy in a certain process, there's no way we can make a dent into this issue. Then implementing solutions actually may reveal new problems. For example, conflicts of interest among stakeholders complicate solutions and delay action, right? Leading to catastrophe after catastrophe. And then what works in one place will not work everywhere. So local, social, economic, geographical, political contexts create unique challenges. And finally, causation is intransitive. So in other words, there are embedded, it's embedded in feedback with other crises, such as climate change. It's almost like it's like an intersectional issue of different factors that intersect with the issue of invasions by non-native pips. Very complicated, right? So there are obvious trade-offs of a reactive policy approach, which is what we have been following. We just wait for the next thing to come in and then try to respond. And as I said earlier, we keep doing the same thing over and over and almost categorically failing every single time. Think about emerald ash borer, sudden oak death on the West Coast, laurel wilt in the Southeast, white pine blister rust. You have it, okay? So here's another sort of version of the invasion curve that we have developed for the paper I mentioned at the very beginning. So at the pre-invasion stage, biosecurity is the most important thing, as along with early detection and rapid response. So if you can, first of all, if you can identify what the next danger may be to your ecosystem before it ever comes here, that occurs through biosecurity and risk assessment, then you're starting on a good, on a good footing, because if you know what's coming, potentially coming next, then you can actually look for it at the border and intercept it there before it ever gets introduced, right? You need to be able to do early detection, as I said before, but also right after it's introduced. Once you recognize it, you have to, if you have any chance at eradicating, you have to be able to detect it, identify it, and implement a rapid response. Similar to what we do with Asian longhorn beetle, but Asian longhorn beetle is a special case because it's an insect that's very easy to detect. It's huge. It doesn't move around very fast, which is very different from, say, emerald ash borer, right? So, and then how do you eradicate something? Do you really have the most effective tools to eradicate a new PIP and so on? Past the introduction stage, though, you get into the spread phase, which is where the thing starts becoming uncontrollable, right? That's why it's spreading. And once it's established, well, you can kiss your ash goodbye. As I used to say, we can kiss our white ashes goodbye with respect to emerald ash borer. Suppression becomes basically impossible. Mitigation of damage and restoration is the only thing that's left. But what happens then? You end up with a different forest, right? So again, that means you've been beat by the system. So there's a lot of reactive policies that we'd like to see change, but it's really a Herculean effort. But I'll give you some perspective on what really needs to be done. Because fundamentally, this issue of invasions by non-native PIPs is a public good social dilemma, right? Think about two countries that have free trade agreements, but they would also like to protect their forest resources. Now, if both countries have strong biosecurity measures with strong, say, inspections at the border, strong systems to verify that their exports are safe and clean and so on, then you end up with lower environmental and societal costs. But this obviously incurs higher net costs to the society in terms of export markets and domestic industry. This is one of the first trade-offs, right, that we have to deal with. Industry will always say, oh, all these regulations are going to make my products too expensive and unsellable to foreign markets. It's going to hurt my industry. And conversely, the other country would say the same thing. But if both did it, then it would be the ideal situation as far as impacts on natural ecosystems and the like. If you have status quo in country number one, but strong biosecurity in country number two, you end up with a trade deficit for, generally speaking, for country number two, but economic benefits for country number one. So these two are not ideal by any stretch of the imagination, but at least one country would benefit in terms of protection of its natural resources. The worst of all worlds, of course, is where you have the status quo for both countries, like we have right now. It's an economically optimal strategy because it makes the cost of goods and services minimized, but it ends up with no mutual trust between the two partners. I cannot trust, for example, that China is really doing sanitation on its wood product, and vice versa. China probably doesn't trust the United States to do the same thing when we export our own stuff. And all this, though, leads to unsustainable costs to environment and society. I mean, this is just to remind you that we are not the only victims of this thing. It's not only the US that receives, for example, bad actors from China or Japan. They have also gotten really bad stuff from us. One example is pine wood nematode. So really, this is the mutual trust and valuation of forests to get here, right? but here's where we are these days. So how do you shift from this situation to, that's why shifting from this situation to the optimal one is a public good social dilemma. It's basically saying, this is a public good, guys. We should be all on the same boat. We should all cooperate for the public good and not be sort of egocentric in a way. So there's, unfortunately, right now, there's lack of goodwill and trust for multilateral strengthening of biosecurity, which leads to the tragedy of the commons of forest health. Tragedy of the commons simply means I'm hoping that the other guy will do the right thing, and the other guy hopes that I will be doing the right thing, and then in the end, nobody does do the right thing, and we end up where we are. So what are the solutions? And I come to the Sentinels in a little bit, but first I just wanted to mention that the solutions really are social, political, economic. So this really should come through the policy cycle, which is an incremental process. First, you define the issue, right? Well, we do have the issue. We know what it is. And then you sort of set a policy agenda. The policy agenda really could be strengthening international biosecurity, implementing integrated pest management whenever possible, have a sustained and comprehensive research funding in all countries, which is not the case by any stretch of the imagination. And really, the change in the policy stance should be from a reactive paradigm to a proactive approach designed to avoid them. We always say prevention is the best solution. Very, very seldom do we actually do that. It's like with human diseases like COVID. Vaccination is the easiest way to be proactive and prevent things to happen, but we know how things go. So once you formulate, you identify a policy agenda, then you have to have policy formulation, policy adoption, and implementation. And for that, there's many institutional constraints that goes through the cycle. For example, in democratic governments, parliamentary nature is fragmented, right? There's fragmented powers, there's roles of committees. One may say one thing, the other one may say another. There's electoral cycles where you swing the pendulum from one approach to another. There's localism. In government, most of the time you have scientific amateurs. I have nothing against lawyers, but most of our representatives are lawyers and they don't understand science at all. So it's very difficult to even explain it to them. Often you have political stalemate and partisanship and so on. And then there's also statutory settings where you have inconsistent and incompatible laws, administrative overload, conflict between agencies, or non-communication between agencies. Think Forest Service, APHIS, USDA, and so on. So there's a lot of obstacles to do things right. But at least if you had an idea of what can be done, then you can start thinking about doing it right? So the bottom line, as far as we're concerned, is that we need to change the whole paradigm. It's not just being able to detect an organism once it comes into the country. That's late. That's too late. And that's what we've been doing for ages without real change. What can we do in the short term? Research funding is always fundamental. So if you guys, I invite you guys to lobby as strong as you can with your representatives for the need for this kind of funding for research. Has to be, the research itself has to be interdisciplinary. Breeding for resistance is foundational, but nobody has the funding to do it. In other words, if you want to restore the forest to what it was like before the incursion by the invasive pathogens and the invasive pips, you have to have resistant stock to do that. Well, if you wait until the emerald ash borer has gone through the whole continent before you even start thinking about selecting and breeding resistant ash, well, that's kind of late. You're sort of late by 20 or 30 years in the process. You need to target high-risk pathways strategically. We know what the highest frequency of exchange of commercial goods and services is between countries and continents. For example, we know which ports are the ones that receive the most containers and therefore have the highest risk of receiving something. So you could do a better job of pre-invasion risk assessment. And the Sentinel trees are one way to do that. And hopefully I'll be able to demonstrate that a little later. And then increase monitoring right now. So we need to develop, but again, through research funding, better rapid detection tools, remote sensing, Sentinel trees for, as you see, in patria or in country biosurveillance, and then leverage emergency funding and customs enforcement agencies to actually do a good thing. And one of the countries that has done one of the best jobs in all of this is New Zealand, because New Zealand is an island country. They've always been very conscious of the risks to their forest resources coming from either through a primary invasion from the invader country of origin, or by way of bridgehead invasions through a third country. So you get a secondary invasion coming to you. All of these are very possible. In fact, have happened several times. Think, for example, Dutch elm disease. It originates in Europe, in Asia, but it came to America by way of Europe, right? So Europe, in that case, served as a bridgehead for the invasion of North America by Dutch elm disease. So the long-term framework for addressing the forest health crisis as a public good social dilemma would include several different foundational components. One of the concepts I've been pushing with some of my colleagues is that to really optimize how we deal with invasive pips, we should really have something like the human CDCs, the Centers for Disease Control for human diseases and animal diseases, provides a very good example of how a centralized structure is actually best equipped at dealing with all sorts of things. I mean, the CDCs has problems. They were limited in their ability to help with COVID by all sorts of very selfish and self-serving, interests, but they still can manage all sorts of human diseases, ranging from COVID in North America to Ebola, outbreaks in Africa. So if we had something like a Centers for Forest Pest Control and Prevention, I think we could go a very long way towards having a more integrated and coordinated approach of the kind I've been presenting this morning. Of course, you need to promote resilience. You need to restore damaged industries and ecosystems. But really, the bottom line is that we need to incentivize global coalitions and collective action to deal with this public good social dilemma. We need to prioritize forest health to ensure adequate focus and a sustained effort. And this here is a huge lift, as you can imagine. But you have to start somewhere. So yeah, I mentioned this, and yeah, very, very clear that the process has to be inclusive and stakeholder driven. You cannot just impose this from above. It has to be a grassroots effort where everybody buys into this, a solution for this social dilemma. And ultimately, we must decide what kind of world we want to live in, right? So we have these intersectionality of global trade and climate change, which is making things really, really difficult for our forest ecosystems. And we really choose resilience, which includes all these different components I've been talking about, or we go to crisis, which is actually what we're doing now. It's all, reactive policy stance. Sometimes you have even invasion denialism and mutual distrust, and you have this cycle that results in uncontrollable invasions of forest environments by things that want to kill trees in big numbers. So in practice and in the shorter term, what can we do? Let's talk about beech leaf disease a little bit as an example. So beech leaf disease, and I'm sure many of you have heard about it, affects this beautiful tree of the eastern United States, Fagus grandifolia, American beech, and that's the only Fagus species in North America. I personally love the tree because it has this beautiful gray, smooth bark and bright foliage, and provides a lot of environmental benefits to Ohio alone, which are estimated to be equivalent to $450 million a year. That's just environmental benefits. Very strangely to a European like me, the timber has no value in this country. We love beech trees, and they're very similar in Europe. The European beech has very similar bark and wood. So I don't understand this reluctance to use beech, but that's beyond my above my pay grade. Maybe Kathy has some ideas. Normally, beech has this beautiful foliage. It's very important ecologically because it's a mast tree. So losing beech will be very, very bad. And this is sort of the beech density distribution based on basal area provided by the Forest Service. So it really is an eastern US species, and it's particularly dense in New England. It's part of this very diverse ecosystem I mentioned earlier, which has been here for eons. So BLD in its essence is a condition where the tree starts showing very strange, very characteristic symptoms that include both this banding pattern between the leaves and this sort of thickening, leathering, crinkling appearance of the foliage, which eventually drops off. And then the ultimate damage is the death in suspension of the buds. In other words, the buds desiccate and they cannot produce new foliage. So over time, you end up with something like this. This is from the early years of the invasion in Ontario. So you have gradual sort of decline of the forest ecosystem. A lot of the younger saplings and young trees in the understory get killed by beech leaf disease. So your regeneration takes a major hit, but big trees are also dying now to an extent that Jerry Carlson, who's the state health, forest health specialist in New York, has called it the second chestnut blight, just to give you an idea of how bad it is. It's been found in ornamental nurseries, so it's also been found on European beech, which has led the Europeans to panic a little bit. So they immediately listed this presumed causal agent, the nematode, Lithyllencus crenata mccannii, on their EPO page, the European the European Plant Protection Organization. Here in America, we have the North American Plant Protection Organization called NAPO. Obviously, this has nothing to do with beech leaf disease. It was just a rotating banner on the webpage. Timeline started in 2012, first noticed in Lake County Metro Parks near Cleveland by John Pogachnik, who's now retired, was a great naturalist. For 3 or 4 years, poor John was ignored by me and other specialists. At that time, I was working heavily on emerald ash borer and sudden oak death, and I was just saying, there's no way I can take this on. I don't know what it is. It's really weird, and so on. But then eventually in 2015, 16, we had a powwow, Lake County Metro Parks, with Cleveland Metro Parks, US Forest Service, Department of Natural Resources, and Ohio State University. And it was then that I proposed to call it beech leaf disease with very low levels of imagination. And it was accepted, and then we finally published an official description in 2019. What I'm showing you here is the current distribution of the disease are the bright green diamonds that you see across the middle there from Northeast Ohio towards New York and Rhode Island and so on. And overlaid on that is a very, very preliminary map of environmental risk for beech leaf disease, which is also itself superimposed on a map of distribution of beech. And these green points here are all what we call rarefied distribution points for American beech. So as you can see, American beech goes all the way down to the coastal plains and all the way up into New England. This is just a map for the US, but we know that beech leaf disease is present also in Ontario in this area. We're just focusing our work on the US. Again, this is a very preliminary risk map, and it's really only a risk of susceptibility. In other words, it doesn't take into account how the disease spreads because we have no idea how it does yet. It's very strange that it's actually spreading in a west to east direction, which suggests maybe prevailing winds, but we don't know. We have no knowledge, and that's in not large part due to the fact that there's no research funding for beech leaf disease, which is crazy. Anyway, it could be a very major. It already is a major issue, and it could be a really major issue if, say, migratory birds are able to move the nematode north to south, for example. So going back to the invasion curve here, what if we were able to actually know that beech leaf disease or the nematode was a potential danger to our eastern forest before it ever came to our borders, right? As the famous philosopher once said, he said many things, but the most famous one is that there are also unknown unknowns, the ones we don't know. And very often that's the case with these invaders. We don't know. We just don't know what we don't know about what's out there that potentially threatens our ecosystems. So here's where the Sentinel tree project comes in. And I will provide you with a scheme of how this works. But essentially what you do, you take, say, North American tree species of importance to you, and you plant them in a foreign locale, like, for example, in China. And then you monitor them and see what attacks them right there, right? So they serve as bait, or the canaries in the coal mine kind of analogy, right? They sit out there and we can monitor them. If something attacks them that tends to do a number on them or kill them, we can try to identify that and then say to our customs and border, what's it called, protection agency, be on the lookout for this particular organism, because it could be a real danger to our country. So it's really a preventative measure. It's a risk assessment tool that will allow us potentially to be on the lookout for the things we don't know even exist yet. All right, so I'm just talking about now this particular project, which is a collaboration with of Ohio State with Sweden, Italy, and China. So 3 different continents. And I'll talk a bit about this. And the first thing I wanted to do was to show you a video that was put out by the Forest Service, because the Forest Service is funding this work. See if I could get there. Just to give you a quick, give me a second here. You still there, guys? Kathy? Yeah? Hope?
We're here.
Okay, good. I'm not talking to myself. All right. So here's a little video, and it's only a couple of minutes, not even a couple of minutes. This is our plot in Columbus. The very beginning. So that's that. The video mentions Florida because in Florida we have an external collaborator who's doing some work on Sentinel plantings, but in a different, using a different strategy. He's not quite part of the same project that we are, but we're both funded by the same Forest Service
Okay,
agency.
so we're going to show you how to
Oh,
graft.
sorry about
I don't have wax and the rubber bands and all the
No, what
materials
this is,
here,
this is
but we'll
coming
give
from
you a
Vimeo.
rough idea how
Give me a
to
second.
graft. But this is called the rootstock, and it really don't matter.
There we go. Sorry. Happens. Anyway, I was saying that in Florida, we have a kind of a parallel project. They're working with China alone. And we are in the same video because the Forest Service International Office is the one that's funding all the work. So here's the strategy. There's two kinds of Sentinel plantings. One is called in patria, which means in country. One is called ex patria or expatria, from, this is Latin, plantings. So this means outside the country, right? Essentially, you use in patria Sentinel plantings, for example, around or near ports of entry. And there you plant your species of interest, your North American species of interest. Let's say we had planted, even if it's not really necessary, but we had organized monitoring of trees of interest around the port of Cleveland, right? If that's where beach leaf disease came in. Then once the nematode was imported into Northeast Ohio, it could have attacked sort of a line of trees that were intensively observed over time, and we would have discovered that infestation very early, right? So that's one way to do it. The other one is to plant your own species, as we are doing in our project, in foreign countries. So in our project, we have a number of North American species planted in China and in Europe. Whereas here in Columbus and also New Hampshire, which is our other site, we have planted Chinese and European species. So we're doing the work for them. So this is a beautiful example of how you can build mutual trust, right, between countries. It is by working together and for the benefit of each other, right? So this is a good example of an approach that builds mutual trust. Unfortunately, right now, the mutual trust is only among academic entities, and we already have a lot of that to start with. It's not between countries or organizations or governments, but it is an example. So we have this fully, what we call a global reciprocal approach to ex patria Sentinel plantings. It's a fully reciprocal cooperative study. And the success of such a project can hopefully pave the way for official establishment of such practices between nations. So we have sites in North America, as I said, Columbus and Portsmouth. And then in Western Europe, we have one in Alnarp, which is in southern Sweden, one in Florence, Italy, which is in central Italy. And then we have two sites in Nanjing, China. And we're working with the Nanjing Forestry University over there. So for experimental design, these are the European and Asian species that we planted. I'll show you the arrangement in a second of the plantings. One important thing is that all planting stock was from national nurseries. In other words, we cannot import large seedlings or saplings for planting in North America. We cannot import it from Europe and China without the risk of also importing new dangers to our own ecosystems. So all these trees that we planted came from nurseries in the US. So we can avoid that particular risk. Unless we were able to import seed and had the time to import the seed, quarantine the seed, or clean it up and make sure that it did not carry any dangerous things with it, we cannot do that. We cannot import seed from abroad and then planting the plants here. That would be ideal, but it has dangers, obviously, and risks, which we want to avoid at all costs. So we had this complete randomized block design. This is the European block, and similarly was the Asian block. You've seen the video. This is how the planting looks like. And yes, after Kathy was asked questions about what the heck are those trees, we put out a big explanatory poster or placard outside the entrance so people can now read what it is about and learn about the project. So early results, we have collected for each tree species, Chinese and European, 20 and 21, we collected, for example, percent incidence of insect damage and percent severity, which means how much of the crown was affected by damage by an insect. Species like Acer truncatum, which is Chinese maple, Albizia julibrissin, Coluteria paniculata, and Tilia cordata, which is European basswood, at the highest frequency and or I should say incidence and severity overall across the 2 years. And we've done a bunch of different quantitative analysis. I won't go through the details. We've done the same with diseases. So in terms of summary, we had 13 species of insects identified in 2020 and 10 insect species identified in 2021 in those orders that you see there, mostly Lepidoptera. And some findings of interest were that, for example, we found the question mark caterpillar on Zircova serrata, which is an Asian species, and this seems to be the first report of feeding on Zircova serrata. Let's say that this was really the first report. We're not 100% certain. You can never be 100% certain. You can only, check the literature and see if that's the case. But if this is the case, then we can tell our Chinese friends, look, Zircova serrata is susceptible to this insect. Maybe you should keep your eyes out for this particular insect to come into your country, So that's really the concept. We found the same for other insects like the white-marked tussock moth. For the fungi, we found, for example, that Botryopsera dotheria, which is usually associated with cankers, has been associated with European basswood in the foliage, which is kind of interesting. And Daldinia species was found on Coluteria paniculata, which is also represents the first finding of this association on this Chinese or Asian species. So we have ongoing work that has to do with molecular identification of some of these species because it's very difficult to identify the fungi to species level. And we're also in the process of collecting DNA to do what is called high throughput sequencing of foliar fungal communities. So we take the leaves and we try to describe all the microbes that are present in that foliage and see if there's anything that pops out as a potential pathogen that could be of interest to our colleagues in the different countries. I will skip this. These are all initial findings from project collaborators across the world. But I think that our work already points to the usefulness of widespread application of the Sentinel plantings as a Sentinel tool, as a tool for risk assessment. I tell you though, the logistics of an operation of this scale carried out by a lowly academic in the US as a major coordinator, they're substantial. I mean, as simple as organizing meetings online across 12 time zones. It's not difficult. You either meet at 9 in the morning in the US, which is 9 in the evening in China, or you don't meet. It's just very difficult. We're trying to finalize the project and start writing papers. Question is, could this have helped predict BLD? Who knows? There was a report of a similar damage on Asian, or I should say, Japanese beech, Fagus crenata. There was a report of a nematode causing similar damage there in 2019. That was published in 2019. It took a while though to make the connection with what is happening here in North America. But if we had a Sentinel planting right where that nematode was found, which included American beech, maybe it's possible that we would have been able to predict that this nematode was very dangerous to American beech And then we could have kept our eyes open, both in terms of interception at the border or immediate detection and eradication, right? So just a few acknowledgements for that particular work. The student has done most of the work on that is Caleb Keim, but also there's a number of other graduate and undergraduate students who've helped. And then, of course, the fundamental funding from the International Office of the Forest Service. What time is it? Let's see.
Couple minutes to 11.
Couple minutes to 11. So I have time. I can talk about early detection a little bit because we've been doing advanced work in this area with beech leaf disease in particular. And this is, I actually forget in this talk if I'm going into a lot of detail because it's rather technical. But the question here, the key question is, how can we rapidly diagnose plants in the pre-symptomatic? The cryptic phase is really the most fundamental phase in disease development, because just like when we catch the flu, when we catch the virus of the flu, we don't become immediately symptomatic. We carry the virus with us for a few days, couple of days before we get the symptoms. It's the same thing with plants. They get infected, but they don't show symptoms of the disease until a few days later or maybe some weeks later. And that's cryptic phase that is very critical because those plants represent the true margin of an invasion center, for example, or an invasion front. It's not the symptomatic plants, it's those that are asymptomatic but carry the pathogen, because they are the bridgeheads that keep moving the disease forward. If you don't get rid of those plants, you only take care of the symptomatic ones, then you're always a step behind. So I hope that makes sense. Another way to ask the question, is there a way we can take a snapshot of a plant and answer the question instantaneously? So that's what we've been working on. So here's a diagrammatic representation of what I was talking about. If you have an infection center or an infection front, you have infected symptomatic plants. Then you have, let me change that again to a laser pointer. Right here. Outside of that, you have sort of a layer of infected pre-symptomatic plants, or these latent infections, and then you get into the naive plants. So these are the ones that have never been exposed, the truly naive plants, the ones that have never been exposed to the pathogen. So unless you take care of these guys here, and you only take care of these in your eradication efforts, you're always going to lose. You're always one step behind. Right now, the only way we can detect the pathogen in these plants is by way of nucleic acid-based tools, so DNA analysis, essentially, or PCR. That's the only way we can detect pathogens here. Well, we're taking a different approach. So I will start with the basics. If you subject any molecule, so this is a molecular structure, to infrared radiation, the molecules will vibrate, all molecules will vibrate in 4 different states, as we call them, each of which absorbs that infrared radiation at different wavelengths or wavebands, okay? Now, if you take, for example, an extract from a plant that contains thousands of different compounds and molecules in different amounts, you can get a infrared spectrum of that mixture of compounds that reflects the composition of the mixture based on the qualities of these vibrational states of the molecules of each molecular bonds. Now, I understand this is quite technical and probably over the head of some of you, but don't worry about it. It's not really critical. What is critical is that, as I said, if you subject a plant material to near infrared radiation, you can get a spectrum back, which is the sum total of the reflectance or absorbance, in this case reflectance, of all the molecules, all the bonds in that mixture, right? So you get the spectrum, a curve, that reflects that overall composition of the plant. And we demonstrated before in another article that came out 2 years ago, that we could use artificial intelligence to detect the pre-symptomatic state of rice plants that were infected with sheath blight, a very important disease of rice plants. This was done in collaboration with colleagues that work on rice. And we had an accuracy of about 86%. So in other words, using this technique, we could tell with an accuracy of 86% which plant was infected and which plant was not. Remember, these are pre-symptomatic plants. So we compare pre-symptomatic to non-inoculated plants. They look exactly the same to us, to the naked eye, but we were able to tell they were different due to the infection using this technique. So we did the same with beech leaf disease, and we used a portable scanner. As you can see here, it's a handheld device. And we generated spectral curves for pre-symptomatic and what we call locally naive trees, essentially growing side to side in Northeast Ohio. And we were able to have prediction accuracies they were very high. These are all different models that were used. And the best models really came up to be the one that included what is called a second derivative or a resampling approach here at the bottom. If I can move that. It's very, very laggy right now. But we are talking about an accuracy close to 100%, right? So 97% accuracy in the resampled, 94 to 97% accuracy in the resampled approach. So extremely successful because we confirmed that the pre-symptomatic material actually had a lot of nematodes in it. We used PCR detection of the nematodes to demonstrate that the pre-symptomatic material, so again, this material looked identical to us as the locally naive material. But the pre-symptomatic material, we could differentiate using this technique from the naive, had way more nematodes in it than the locally naive trees, right? So it was a great success all around, and we were able to publish it actually earlier this summer. And we hope that some agencies will consider taking this on for early detection of beech leaf disease. So where do you go from here? Back to the invasion curve, because this is really the foundation of everything we do or try to do to protect our forest environments. And really boils down to research. We don't have enough information about a lot of these things. We don't know how to do pathway analysis very well yet to predict. We don't know how to predict the next danger, although using sentinel plantings would be a big step forward. But in the case of beech leaf disease, for example, we don't even know, we're not even sure where it came from or if it came from anywhere. We think it's a non-native coming from Asia, but we don't have the scientific proof. We don't know how it got here. We presume it's on live plants for planting because nematodes, foliar nematodes, cannot really survive outside of their plant material. Also, is it really the nematode? There's also work that's sort of debating this, or rather saying that maybe the nematode needs something else like a bacterium to cause damage. We're not there yet. We don't know how it spreads. What is its epidemiology? There's some interesting work being done about the Forest Service on migratory birds as possible vectors. There are birds that, for example, eat buds, beech buds, like there's no tomorrow, and beech buds are one of the tissues in which the nematodes actually reside. How does the nematode interact with the host? Can we harness the molecular basis of the interaction? We're going to do some work in that area with Paulo Vieira from the USDA ARS in Beltsville. More questions. What's the ecological, economic, human impact? We really don't know yet. We don't know if there's resistance in the native population of American beech. If there were, could we use it to restore American beech after beech leaf disease has run its course? Are there any other management options on landscape scales? There are some emerging management options for beech leaf disease on individual trees and ornamental settings, particularly the use of phosphonates and polyphosphates. The work seems very promising, but it's not been published yet. But there's nothing on landscape scales. We really don't know what to do. And in the context of today's talk, the holy grail would be, could BLD have been predicted and prevented or snuffed out very early? Well, maybe if we had a whole infrastructure that I was talking about, this could have been avoided, right? So, but anyway, if we want to do research, I already said we need funding. And so whether you want to contribute to my program directly, you can do that on my website. You can, and that would be tax deductible, or by lobbying your legislators that this is really important stuff and needs to be done. We academics and others cannot do any work without the funding, obviously. So with that, I'm going to close, and I hope you found this interesting, instructive, and I'd be very happy to answer any questions that you may have. So I'm going to stop sharing here if I can. Hopefully.
Enrico, you've fallen into my argument by using the picture of the oval. I always say that we don't spend enough money on our campus trees, but what's the image we use to sell the university? The oval and all the trees. Like,
oh, we spend money, but badly, right? In the wrong way.
Yeah, that's true too. Okay, well, awesome. I find this just fascinating. And of course, you know, when I first learned what you were doing, I too was one of those. It's like, you're planting vegetation from where? Yeah, you don't want to contribute to a problem that's already here, but man, we got to get our.
By the way, the trees in that Asian plot, they grow like gangbusters. I mean, it's amazing. The plants themselves are invasive, right?
Right.
So we are very careful with that. We have been pruning them back big time. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it's something that we have to be cognizant of, but you're right. I've got a talk together for pesticide applicators this year that kind of goes through these things that have invaded. I start with chestnut blight and kind of move forward, and you realize that what your chestnut blight was, Dutch elm disease, what year, gypsy moth or spongy moth, and then all of a sudden it's like emerald ash borer, spotted lanternfly, thousand canker disease. I mean, it's like boom, 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 boom.
Pretty much after the WTO let China in, things exploded for us, somewhat for them. So it really has such a huge, an enormous link to global trade.
Right. Yeah.
And
as a forester, you know, talk to this forester coming out of college, we didn't talk invasive species. We didn't really even talk invasive plants.
Right.
And today I spend a good portion of my time on invasives, trying to help landowners navigate that issue. And it's, I was laughing at myself this year as this fall, after all the leaves came off, I drove down the county road along the farm and I looked back through the woods, and what did I see? Little tiny burning bushes all throughout the woods. And I'm like, yeah, I know what my work is. So it's tough.
But then you're chasing, right? You're chasing these things forever.
Right.
I mean, it's when I see poor, Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts go out and try to extirpate honeysuckle, right? It's like, why even bother? I mean, it's like, makes you feel good, but you're beat.
Yeah. Well, I'm hoping that since they're all these little tiny scattered, that maybe I can hit them. But my neighbor across the road in his woods has 3 large shrubs, and I've asked him a couple times to cut them down, and it's like
mutual trust. It's the same thing. The mutual trust I was talking about.
Yeah.
at the continental, at the global level happens between neighbors. It's the
Yes.
same exact thing.
Local
Yeah.
level.
It's
Yeah.
human
Yeah.
behavior. Yeah, it's human
Yeah.
behavior.
He looked at me and he says, well, I can probably do that, but they're still there 2 years later. And that's the seed source. And as I always tease Marnie, her wildlife who eat over there and then come rest in my woods and leave me presents. So.
Yeah.
You just need to do like a late night shopping sign. I don't know what happened to them.
Oh, who would have cut those off?
Yeah, that might make you look a little suspicious.
Yes, it probably would. So we do have a few questions. Chris wants to know if you can share the link to the video.
Yeah, I tried to find it, but I couldn't.
Yeah, I was gonna go look and I couldn't see.
Yeah, I can
Yeah.
do it. Give me a second here, and I put it in the chat box.
Yep, put it in the chat.
I mean, it's the video is part of a page that was put out by the Forest Service International Office to show their activities. So there's also a description, which is helpful, of the
Mhm.
project. So let me do that.
Okay.
Oh, wait a minute.
What?
I sent it only to hosts and panelists. There we
Oh,
go.
we can pick it up and,
There we go.
Oh, yep, you got it.
okay.
Yeah.
So Elena asked, do you also monitor the trees you brought in for invasive properties to the US, looking to see how they move off-site into nearby forests and natural areas?
I'm not sure I understand the question. What is again? What
So
is it?
you brought in what we were just kind of talking about. You brought in these non-native plants. Are you monitoring them to make certain that they're not spreading out into the environment around your plots?
Yeah, but I mean, those came from ornamental nurseries in the US.
Yeah, but that still can be a problem.
No, I understand that. We established those little plots in the middle. It was sort of visible from the video. It's like an opening in a wooded area just up in Chadwick Arboretum North. So that it's kind of contained by other trees around it. And then outside of that small wooded area, there's really nothing that can be invaded because it's campus stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But will you, I guess the question would be, will you monitor kind of that small wooded area to make certain that nothing leaves your plot?
Yeah.
Okay. Marcia asked, what's the latest research on beech leaf disease? Have any of the tests shown any product that can kill the nematodes once the tree is infected? Some trees were being tested with polyphosphate 30 to prevent the tree from dying. Has that been successful? There's a whole slew here. Have any of the nematodes or the nematicides been successful in killing the nematodes in infected trees? That's a nematode heavy sentence.
Nematicides. Yeah.
Yes.
The
Nematicides, yeah.
There we go.
So far, no products have been able to demonstrate high levels of nematode kill in the plant. But the polyphosphate 30 has been successful in protecting the trees or even curing the trees of damage over repeated years of application. The problem is that it's not been published, so it cannot be recommended at this point. I've seen the work though, and it's really promising. The way polyphosphates seem to work is by promoting the natural defenses of the trees, not by killing the nematodes. So it's an interesting sort of twist on control or management. But you can only do that on individual trees.
Right.
Because it's a soil drench, huh?
Well, that's where I get pulled into some things that, well, can we do this in the forest? And it's like, it's not going to be economical to do it in the forest.
Or ecologically feasible.
Right.
Or even, thinkable.
Right. I mean, I know of a landowner who's treating all of his ash and has lost some, but he's got a routine that he goes out and applies, and it's like, more power to you, but what are you sacrificing by trying to save the ash? And I think that's a question we haven't really looked at to answer in that point, because most woodland owners aren't going to venture there. They're just not going to spend that kind of money for their
There are
wood.
some comments I wanted to address in the chat box, especially by Elena Stierhoff. I
Okay.
hope, yeah. She's complaining a little bit about the fact that I mentioned funding a bit too often, but that's what we academics do all the time. So I'm sorry if it detracted from the presentation, but if we want answers, that's a truth. That's what we need. And then there's a comment about the reason to not give up and keep removing the honeysuckle and other invasives from the land you do control is to preserve future generations, is to show essentially future generation what an invasive tree forest is supposed to look like and function. Its beauty and support of natural ecosystem. So don't give up. Yeah, I agree. I mean, if it's a demonstration effort, by all means, but you're not going to defeat an invasive species like honeysuckle by doing these little projects.
Okay. Janice asks, if my American beech is infected, should I have it taken down and burned? Do landscape companies inadvertently spread it by using chips from infected trees as mulch?
So chips, no. But the reality is that we still don't know how it spreads. So we cannot give recommendations even about tree disposal. It would make sense that if you're afraid that you're going to move the nematode around, you will get rid of all the green material at least. So the foliage, the buds, essentially everything that has to do with twigs and branches. Okay. And if you burn it, that would be great. If you bury it, that would be great. If you don't move it, that's also good. So it's but again, that's based on the fact that we know that there's a strong association with the nematode, but we don't know how the nematode itself moves around.
And that's kind of what I've been saying when folks ask. We know there's a nematode involved, but we don't know cause and effect and a lot of things. We know it's there, but there's a whole lot more we don't know. So Leah asks, are the Sentinel trees ones that are already in the country, which is planting them?
So there's the two types I mentioned, right? The in-country and the outside country Sentinel plantings. The in-country plantings are the ones that include your own species of interest. And you use those as the canaries in the coal mine around ports of entry. The ex-country, the expatria plantings are the ones like what we are doing, where we planted Chinese and European species to be able to tell our friends over there what the next danger to them could be on those particular tree species.
Carolyn asks, I offer to remove the invasive species on my neighbor's property.
Good for her.
Yeah, good for her.
Was she punched in the face?
Let's see. Janice says, I have my red oaks injected with a preventative for oak wilt. Sorry, I can't remember the name of the chemical. There you go. Is it worth the cost? In other words, is it effective?
It is. If it's done properly and on time, meaning before any symptoms show up on the tree. If you know there's oak wilt in your area and your trees, especially the red oak, oaks, still look okay, then preventative injections with propiconazole are effective.
Okay. Caroline wants to know if BLD affects tricolor beech as well.
Yes.
I thought so. Mary Mason. Hi, Mary.
Hi, Mary.
The American Public Gardens Association also has a Sentinel network in some gardens.
Yes.
Does your group coordinate with that network?
No, we're not coordinating in that effort. That's led by other folks. I know the Forest Service is involved in that. In fact, and Mary knows him. Richard Nesco out of Oregon is in the he's not in the Forest Service. He's in the National Park Service, I think. But he works on selection for resistance in North American tree species. But he's got involved in this network of arboreta, what do you call them? Public gardens and so on, where they're trying to monitor what goes on those trees. And those gardens, arboreta, obviously have a mix of indigenous and non-native trees, right? So they can monitor both sides of the equation, the dangers to your own country, but also the dangers to the other countries.
Okay.
Yeah, there is an ongoing network of observations.
Good deal.
In my case, it's more. Oh, he's married. Oh, sorry. Yeah, he is in the Forest Service, but
He's with state and private.
actually, I don't know. I have to check, Mary. I think he's not. Anyway.
All right, you two. Marquetta asked, do you encourage landowners to plant beech to try to find resistant trees?
No, it's not worth it. I would encourage people, citizen scientists, to see if they can locate what we could call, in honor to the ash effort that Mary Mason has been involved in, lingering beech, which could potentially be resistant. And if they do, they could report it to me or other people involved in beech leaf disease research, with the understanding, though, that we may or may not be able to do anything about it. So, in fact, Mary, I don't know if Mary can come online here, but Mary works with Jennifer Koch at the Delaware Forest Service research station here in Ohio. And they are working on selection and breeding of resistant ash to emerald ash borer. But they're also working on resistance and breeding of American beech resistant to beech bark disease. So these things can be done, but sorry, Elaine, but they take funding.
So Marnie did give Mary access, so she's there if she wants to answer.
Yeah.
So Michaela asks, hello, Michaela, how can we help convince leaders to transition to a more proactive versus reactive approach? Do we need to reallocate funding being spent on invasive plant control treatment to other efforts you mentioned, like research on resistance breeding and increasing monitoring?
Yeah, that's a great question. It should be an effort that's coordinated at a high level, but it might be as simple as starting to talk to your representative or senator and saying, I'm really concerned about what's going on. What have you done in this area? And then suggest maybe you could talk to these people in academia and they could explain to you what the real issue is and all that. I mean, I've tried to do some of that with OSU's liaison office to Congress and state legislature. There's been some success in terms of, for example, David Joyce from Northeast Ohio asking questions of the Forest Service, for example, during congressional, questioning about beech leaf disease itself. What are you doing in this area, sort of thing. So anything really can help. On our end, we are trying to, as I said, through our various liaison offices, to make people aware of these issues. But as I said in my presentation, a lot of these have no science background. It's really, really difficult to explain these things to them. I have prepared one-pagers, that I can distribute to give the basics of the problem and what the impacts are. But anything, I think, if everybody was complaining about this, maybe there would be some movement.
Well, I know as the Ohio chapter for Society of American Foresters, we used to do legislative events when there were key components that we felt like for forests in Ohio we had to address. And we'd either go downtown and walk office to office, or, do some kind of breakfast or lunch or something where we could have those conversations. But it's so hard to pull those folks together that I mean, SAF gave up on it in some contexts because it was just, you were getting aides coming to the meetings, and that's fine, except you really would like to talk to the person that is making those decisions and not necessarily an aide. Not that an aide can't do great things, but
Yeah,
when you're talking to everybody's aides and not to the representative, it's a little frustrating.
yeah. And Mary put in a comment there, and Tree Snap is an application. Mary, if you could, actually, you just send it to the panelists. And so
Oh, she did, yeah.
Yeah. Can you share the Tree Snap website with everyone? That would be great. Yeah, Tree Snap is a great little app that you can have on your phone to report, for example, beech trees that seem healthy. Judy Samrock is asking, what are some of the best tree species to recommend to homeowners who are losing a good bit of trees? So anything native would go, as far as I'm concerned. Nothing is immune from everything.
Right.
But right now, maples seem to be pretty resilient, except for ALB, Asian longhorn beetle. And yeah, I would say, and maybe Mary can also, Kathy can also, and Marn can also contribute here. I would say if it was me, I would just plant native trees.
And you're never going to have a tree that can't have some kind of issue. I mean, that's just, the one I get for beech that's not beech leaf disease is the little boogie woogie aphids. When they see those creatures lined up on the twigs, bebopping around, everyone tends to panic. And but it's not beech leaf disease. I just actually answered that question for a pesticide person that treats trees for things. He's like, I've never seen this one before. So there's a lot of things out there, but I would agree with Enrico. If you can stick with the natives, or cultivars of the natives, I'm not so anti-native cultivar, though. I think you have to look and see. For me, if a tree species is an early heavy cedar, those are two red flags for me, because it's like they start producing seed early and they produce boatloads of seed, which is how we ended up with sawtooth oak, because it's an early acorn producer, and the wildlife folks put it in packets galore, and it's been planted in a lot of places that I'd rather not see it planted, but once they're in the ground, it's a little harder to deal with. So Enrico, Claire asks, what about the chemicals used to save the trees? Can they harm the insects that might eat their fruit or leaves?
I don't have an answer to that, a direct answer to that. I do have some concerns that if the mechanism I described, which is with polyphosphites, is the enhancement of the natural defenses of the tree. If the tree becomes sort of naturally more defended against nematodes, it might also become more defended against some insects, including potentially pollinators. But this is just speculation. I really don't have any basis to say that.
Okay. Let's see, we already answered that one. So Danny wants to know, how does breeding resistance work for organisms where we know pips differentially affect different life stages? e.g. beech leaf disease is less impactful to older trees, how would one determine genetic resistance to pips separate from those size-based considerations?
Well, that's a very good question that demonstrates understanding of the fact that different levels of resistance can be expressed at different stages of the life cycle of a tree. So kudos to that. But the best we can do really is to, when you do breeding for resistance, is to work on small plants, on small trees, for the most part. And maybe Mary can also contribute to this conversation. So the hope is that if a sapling is resistant to something, that the grown-up plant will also be resistant.
Okay. Leah asks, utility companies maintain rights of way and well areas, which are often directly through woodlands. Are these types of vehicles or this type of work under any regulations for cleaning and checking equipment from property to property?
I don't know the answer to that, but my guess is not.
Probably not.
I don't think so.
So it's like the Forest Service has cleaning stations that they require their vendors, if they're moving from compartment A to compartment B, everything gets washed down before it moves to compartment B.
Definitely not in Ohio. I mean,
Right.
if in Oregon, for example, there are regulations where people working in forest environments have to disinfect for example, their equipment, their tires, their shoes, when they're moving from one place to another to avoid the spread of Phytophthora lateralis, which is the pathogen that causes the root rot of Port Orford cedar, which is an endemic species there and is highly protected. But that's kind of rare in this country. You would see things like those more often in places like New Zealand and perhaps Australia, who understand this sort of biosecurity in forest environments much better than we do.
Oh, he froze. There he goes. You froze there for a minute.
Oh, sorry. I don't know what you meant. Yeah.
So we were through the questions. I don't see any more popping up. And Marnie, have you been monitoring the chat? Because I have not.
Yep, I think we addressed all of them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So let me